So in January 2023, my mom and I bought some land out in the countryside of Washington State, and that wasn't the first piece of land that we looked at. So in this video, I just want to explain to you what we learned in the process of looking for and buying the land, and I hope that will be helpful to you in your own search. Before we get into this, I just want to say I'm not an expert in this by any means. I'm just a person who is looking for some land to build a house, and this is what I've learned. Like most people, I imagine, I use Zillow to search for some land. I first looked near national parks and other outdoor attractions because my first idea for the property was to make a little glamping site, build some A-frame cabins and earn some income and save up to then build a proper house. I imagined that this would be easy to do with any piece of land, but I soon learned that that was not the case. A glamping site requires a particular kind of zoning. And if you're not familiar with zoning means, zoning is a designation that the county makes for what can be built on what piece of land. So some parcels of land might be zoned as residential, some as commercial, some as industrial, some as farmland, and those all have certain restrictions on how they can be used. For example, you can't build a big grocery store on a residentially zoned piece of property. To find out how a property is zoned, copy the street address and then search for that county's parcel viewer. This will vary, of course, but find the search function and then paste in the property's address. Counties seem to do everything by parcel number, so keep that once you learn what it is. In the parcel information, we can see this property is zoned as Rural 10, and you can learn a lot more about it, including the fact that this one is in a flood zone and has wetlands. To learn more about the zoning, you might have to click around a bit to find the county regulations page and search for that particular zoning designation. So because of how all the land I was interested was zoned, I eventually shifted my ideas to just building a regular house. So the properties that were in our price range and of interest to us all were zoned as Rural Residential 5. And that means that you could build one primary dwelling and one accessory dwelling unit for every 5 acres of land. In our case, the land we bought is only 1.7 acres, but that rule still applies. So we can still build 2 houses on that property. As far as I know, properties usually have setback rules, and that probably differs on the county you live in and on how your property is zoned. In our case, with the land zoned as Rural Residential 5, we're allowed to build within 20 feet of the side of the property and 25 feet from the front or the back. In our case, we have a very small lake at the back of the property, and that comes with a setback rule of 50 feet from the shoreline. By applying for something called a variance, you may get exceptions to that setback rule. So in our case, if we applied for a variance, we could build within 5 feet of the sides of the property and within 10 feet of the front or back. But again, not within 50 feet of the lake's shoreline. As for the buildings you can construct themselves, the county and the zoning may dictate how big and how tall they can be. In our case, the home can be up to 35 feet tall and any square footage, but the accessory dwelling unit can only be 80% of the original home size up to a maximum of 1,200 square feet. Aside from any zoning and building rules from the county, make sure to check if the property you're interested in is part of a homeowners association, which may have its own set of rules on what you can do there. Aside from imposing additional restrictions to what you can and can't do with your property, an HOA may also have ongoing costs like yearly dues associated with it. In our case, it's about $250 a year to help maintain the road. Even once you know what the zoning and building regulations allow you to do on a particular piece of land, you still need to do your due diligence with each parcel. There are a lot of things that could affect your ability to build. Are there steep slopes? Is there a shoreline? Are there wetlands? Are there existing properties or infrastructure already on the land? And if so, are they up to code? Are water and electricity easily available? So for Mason County, where we bought our land, the first step appears to be to ask the county to do what's called a site pre-inspection report. For ours, a county planning department employee came out and looked at the land and then issued us a report that was basically a roadmap of what we need to take into consideration and what the restrictions are for building on this particular piece of land. That report cost $300. On the first property that we seriously considered and in fact put an offer on, I came across a site pre-inspection report available in the public records. In there, it mentioned the requirement for a geotechnical report because the land had slopes greater than 40% within 300 feet. This geotech report would be required before anything could be built on the land, and it would tell you where it's safe to build based on the soil composition and the slopes of the land. The county told me that geotech reports generally cost between $1,000 and $5,000, so it's not a trivial matter. I was able to get a quote for $1,900 in case we wanted to proceed. So with this first property that we were quite excited about, my mom and I did put an offer on it because we didn't want it to disappear. And very importantly, we had a 1-month window in which we could assess if the property was right for our needs and back out with no consequences if we found it was lacking in some way. And we found several problems. That site report I found also mentioned the possible existence of a jurisdictional wetland, which could bring with it a whole set of restrictions on that property. Indeed, before we could do anything with that property, we would have to have hired a wetlands biologist to come out and assess the property to determine the extent of any existing wetlands and any setbacks from that. When I talked to the county about this property, they were quite concerned that the previous owners had filled in that wetlands without permission. They then warned me that if we wanted to build on that property, we would first have to remediate the wetlands, and that could cost at least $30,000 and possibly take years with other government agencies involved in the remediation process. Because we were so interested in this property, I did contact a wetlands biologist who, for $500, could do a preliminary visit and determine if that was a wetland. And if we wanted a full report, that would probably cost $3,300 and be 3 months out. In the end, that wetlands biologist did determine that there was a wetland filled in with the gravel by the previous owners, and that would be a serious remediation effort. Another issue we came into with this first property we put the offer on was that the previous owners had built a septic system on there with no permission, a so-called bootleg septic system. This was also, of course, right next to the wetlands, and the septic system would have to be decommissioned somehow. In addition to that, in looking at the satellite images, we saw that the neighbor's house might actually have been built across the property line, and that would have been another headache to try and figure out. Strangely enough, Mason County doesn't seem to require surveys to determine where the boundaries of your property are before you build. In looking at this first property, we also learned that the county requires you to have a reliable water source before you can do any building whatsoever. I asked if they would accept a rainwater catchment system, but that was not considered reliable. Since there is no municipal water supply coming to this neighborhood, we would have to dig a well. Our real estate agent told us that we could approach one of the neighboring properties and ask if they had a well that we could share in, but that was by no means a guarantee. So that means that we might have to have our own well drilled, and we were told it could cost $100 a foot, and that this well would have to probably be 300 feet deep. That alone would mean securing a water source will cost $30,000 at least. For this property, electricity was the least of our concerns because there was a public utility district line running along the streets in that neighborhood. Before that month window on our offer of this property expired, my mom and I withdrew the offer because these were way too many red flags to continue. The geotech surveyor that we had talked to said he was very glad that we had done our due diligence because he had been in a position to tell many new landowners that they couldn't do what they thought they could do on the land that they had just purchased. On the parcel of land that we did end up buying, we started off by having a county employee come out and do a site pre-inspection. About a week later, we received a copy of the report by email. As expected, it confirmed that we would need to have a geotechnical report done because the property has a steep slope within 300 feet. And having spoken with the geotechnical surveyor for the previous property, we weren't really concerned about this because he had told us that the soils in that area were quite stable for building on. Aside from that, this property was in a small neighborhood with very similar parcels, and other people had been able to build their houses on theirs. The site pre-inspection report also said that there were no wetlands we'd have to worry about, but it did talk about the shoreline of the lake and about the 50-foot setback from there, and it also mentioned that we couldn't do any vegetation clearing within 35 feet of that shoreline. For septic, we simply have to have another septic survey done. The previous owners had done one before and there's some perk holes in the property, but 2 years had elapsed, so it would have to be done again. As for a reliable source of water, this property is part of a homeowners association and they have a community well with a connection already at our site. For electricity, the public utility district already has lines running down our access road, and so it's just a matter of submitting plans to them and getting the connection installed. As for existing structures, there were none on this property, and those on our neighboring properties were quite far back from the property lines. One of our neighbors that had the property line already surveyed, so we could see the pink survey marks along one side, and on the other side there were no buildings whatsoever, so we weren't concerned about encroachment by any neighboring properties. So in summary, do your homework. Find out what zoning allows, find out what surveys are required, and find out if there are any natural or built features on that land that could cause you issues in building what you want. So I hope this video has been helpful, and good luck in your own search. Thanks for watching.